My husband was standing on stage, holding a microphone, basking in the applause of 300 people as he told my war story. He detailed the pitch-black night in Helmand Province, the deafening mortar fire, and the precise, icy tactical calls that saved 6 trapped Marines, claiming every single action as his own bravado. I sat at a back table in silence, my hands gripping the edge until my knuckles turned white. He thought I was just his quiet, supportive wife who would keep her mouth shut to protect his fragile ego. But as he reached the climax of his stolen heroism, a towering retired Marine in full dress uniform stood up at the front table. His chair scraped violently against the floor, cutting right through the applause. He looked straight at my husband, then turned his gaze slowly toward me, his voice echoing across the quiet hall. "You didn't lead that extraction. Reaper did. My name is Sarah Mitchell. At 34, if you saw me in the grocery store or tending to my garden, you'd probably think I was just another quiet woman living a comfortable suburban life. You wouldn't know that beneath my business casual clothes, my shoulders carry scars from Helmand Province, or that during my 2 tours in Afghanistan as an army captain, my unit knew me by a single call sign, Reaper. I earned that name not out of arrogance, but out of necessity. As an officer leading a joint tactical team under fire, when mortar shells were tearing up the earth and chaos was screaming in the headsets, my pulse slowed down. I made cold, lethal decisions with absolute precision, but when I left the army, I buried that part of my life. I locked my silver star, my combat badges, and my old captain's uniform in a heavy oak desk drawer in my home office. I didn't need to brag at dinner parties. I didn't need civilian applause to validate what I had survived. Then came my husband, Richard. Richard was a corporate manager with high society ambitions and a deeply fragile ego. When we first met, he claimed to admire my strength, but over 5 years of marriage, his unspoken insecurity grew into resentment. He hated that when people asked about my past, I kept my answers short and composed. To Richard, a dramatic story was currency, something to impress investors and climb social ladders. It started small. A white lie at a neighborhood barbecue about how we handled high-stress crisis management. An exaggerated story about military life that he spun to make himself sound like a protective hero. I let it slide to keep the peace. I thought it was just harmless posturing to boost his self-esteem. I had no idea he was studying my past, gathering details, and preparing to steal my entire identity. 6 months ago, Richard decided to run for regional director, a high-visibility political seat that required a compelling public image. His campaign platform heavily emphasized veteran advocacy, duty, and community sacrifice. Since he had never served a single day in uniform, he used my background as his primary political asset. At first, he just talked about being a proud military spouse, but as the stakes grew higher, his ambition completely corrupted his judgment. The turning point came at a lavish campaign fundraising gala in downtown Sacramento. The room was packed with city council members, wealthy donors, and local press. Midway through the evening, Richard took the stage under a bright spotlight, microphone in hand. I sat at a table near the front, expecting his usual polished speech about local infrastructure and economic growth. Instead, he adjusted his tie, lowered his voice, and began recounting the horrific 2017 ambush in the Sangin district. My heart stopped. Every detail he spoke was real: the pitch-black night, the blinding dust storm, the sound of RPGs shattering the transport convoy, and the tactical radio calls that pulled 6 trapped soldiers out of a death trap. But Richard didn't tell the room that his wife had executed that mission. He stood on that stage, adjusted his shoulders, and told 300 cheering attendees that he had been the tactical team leader who braved the fire, made the call, and saved those lives. I sat frozen as the room erupted into a standing ovation for my husband's stolen sacrifice. The ride home was suffocatingly quiet. As soon as the garage door closed behind us, I turned on Richard, my voice trembling with a rage I hadn't felt since my days downrange. How dare you stand up there and lie to those people? That was my team. Those were my men who bled in Sungin. You weren't even in the military, Richard. Richard didn't look ashamed. He calmly took off his designer jacket, hung it up, and looked at me with a condescending smirk. Relax, Sarah. It's called optics. It's storytelling for political traction. You think those voters give a damn about policy? They want a hero. You stole my life, Richard. You stole my Silver Star story and claimed it as your own. Because nobody cares about a retired female veteran sitting quietly in the back of the room, he snapped, stepping into my space, his eyes cold and calculating. You buried that story in a desk drawer. I'm giving it value. I'm building a future for us with it. Do you really want to ruin my entire career over your fragile pride? I stared at him, realizing for the first time that the man I married was completely devoid of honor. He didn't feel a shred of remorse. In fact, as he poured himself a drink, he casually mentioned his speech for the upcoming Veterans Day banquet, where key political donors and high-ranking military officials would be in attendance. He was going to do it again, and he expected me to play along. The grand ballroom of the Hilton was filled with over 400 guests for the annual Veterans Day Gala. Active duty officers in crisp dress uniforms, local politicians, business moguls, and wealthy campaign donors mingled under massive crystal chandeliers. Tonight, Richard was slated to receive the Community Leadership Award, the crowning achievement of his political campaign. I chose not to wear my uniform or pin my ribbons to my dress. I wore a simple black evening gown, keeping my posture relaxed, my voice soft, and my expression unreadable. Richard took my quietness for submission. He spent the cocktail hour smugly patting my shoulder, introducing me to donors as his supportive wife, convinced that he had successfully intimidated me into silence. He truly believed he owned me, my history, and my voice. When the dinner concluded, the master of ceremonies stepped to the podium to introduce the keynote speaker. He read off Richard's fabricated biography, praising his unwavering tactical bravery and selfless sacrifice under fire. The audience applauded warmly as Richard smoothed his tie, flashed his practiced, teeth-baring smile, and walked up the steps to the stage. He took the microphone, leaned into the spotlight, and began his speech. At first, he spoke about leadership and civic duty, but within 5 minutes, he skillfully steered the narrative right back into the dark valleys of Afghanistan. He launched into the dramatic play-by-play retelling of the Sangin extraction. The room went dead silent as he described the mortar fire, the smoke, and the life-or-death decisions. But tonight, he took his betrayal one step further. He looked out at the packed hall, placed a hand over his heart, and declared that during that bloody battle his brothers in arms had bestowed upon him a solemn call sign, Reaper. Richard paused for dramatic effect, allowing his stolen title to hang in the air while he soaked in the reverent silence of the room. He took a slow sip of water, preparing to deliver his final practiced punchline about heroism and service. He never got the chance. At a table near the front, a towering man in a Marine Corps dress blue uniform stood up. The heavy wooden chair scraped violently against the banquet hall's tile floor, making a sound like a gunshot that sliced right through the silence. The man was Master Gunnery Sergeant Vance, a decorated veteran whose chest was covered in combat ribbons, his face carved with deep, weather-worn lines. The entire room froze. Richard blinked under the harsh spotlight, his smile wavering for a fraction of a second. "Sir? Is there a problem?" Richard asked, trying to maintain his polished, authoritative tone. "Yeah, there's a massive problem," Sergeant Vance's voice boomed, echoing off the high ceilings like a thunderclap. He stepped away from his table, his eyes locked onto Richard with terrifying intensity. I was in Songin in 2017. My squad was pinned down in that compound under heavy machine gun fire. I remember every single second of that night. And the captain who coordinated our air support, who took out that sniper tower, and who personally dragged 3 of my men into the extraction chopper wasn't some suit wearing a fancy watch. Gasps rippled across the ballroom. Donors looked at each other in confusion. Richard's face drained of all color, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Sergeant Vance slowly turned his body away from the stage. He walked right past the stunned audience and stopped directly in front of my table. He stood at rigid attention, looked me dead in the eye, and executed a sharp, flawless military salute to his former commanding officer. "The captain who saved my life was named Reaper," Vance said loudly enough for every microphone to catch. "And she's sitting right here." The banquet hall erupted into total chaos. Whispers cascaded through the crowd like a wildfire, turning into loud, demanding murmurs from city officials and major donors. Camera flashes began going off wildly as local journalists at the back of the room raised their phones, recording every second of the disaster unfolding on stage. Richard gripped the podium until his knuckles turned white, his forehead glistening with sudden nervous sweat. This is a misunderstanding. My wife and we worked as a team," he stammered, his voice cracking into the microphone. "Shut up, civilian!" another veteran shouted from the middle tables, standing up alongside 2 active duty officers. "You don't get to hide behind her uniform." Sergeant Vance didn't flinch. He stayed standing at attention before me until I calmly rose from my seat, met his eyes, and returned his salute. When I turned toward the stage, the sheer cold authority in my gaze hit Richard like a physical blow. He tried to speak again, but no sound came out. The polished politician had completely evaporated, leaving behind a terrified, exposed fraud who couldn't name a single military grid coordinate or tactical radio frequency to save his life. Event organizers rushed the stage, abruptly turning off Richard's microphone and asking him to step down. The master of ceremonies hurriedly announced an early end to the evening, but the damage was already done. By the next morning, the footage of Sergeant Vance exposing Richard had gone viral across local and national news networks. The campaign board issued an emergency press release stripping Richard of his candidacy and demanding his immediate resignation from his corporate executive position due to character fraud. The man who tried to climb to the top of the world on my stolen scars had lost everything in less than 60 seconds. The divorce was swift and non-negotiable. With the overwhelming evidence of financial exploitation and character fraud, my legal team ensured that Richard walked away with nothing from my personal assets or veterans' benefits. He left Sacramento shortly after, unable to face the public disgrace and the quiet disgust of the community he had tried so hard to manipulate. For me, the aftermath wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming the truth I had buried for far too long. Connecting with Sergeant Vance and the men from my old unit brought back memories I thought I had locked away forever. But this time, those memories didn't bring pain. They brought closure. Sitting down with real comrades who understood the sacrifice, the silence, and the weight of service reminded me of who I truly was. I wasn't just a quiet civilian trying to blend in. I was a leader who had brought her people home. I finally unlocked that oak desk drawer. I took out my silver star, my captain's bars, and my framed service records, and I mounted them on the wall of my study. Not out of vanity, and not to boast to visitors, but as a quiet reminder to myself that no one has the right to rewrite your history, silence your voice, or steal the sacrifices you survived. Honor isn't something you can buy, borrow, or fake for a crowd. It's forged in the darkest moments of your life when nobody is watching. I spent years keeping quiet to keep the peace, but I learned that true peace only comes when you stand tall in your own truth. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I served my country, I led my team, and I am Captain Reaper.